Thank you very much. That was a lovely introduction. I'm so happy to be here today. Alex Shrian was meant to be here and unfortunately couldn't make it, but I'm a PhD supervisor, so I feel like I'm well placed to be able to present for her. And since moving back and being at Central Queensland University, we've been doing a lot of work in the sleep hygiene space and healthy sleep practices, and I'm still going to have that shift work focus as well that she was going to be focusing on. So I've tried to stay true to what she had originally aimed to present, but I am such a big advocate for sleep health and education, so seeing you guys give up your weekends to come here and learn about it gets me so excited, because it's definitely been something that's kind of lacked compared to physical activity and healthy eating. So it's so exciting to see sleep actually being out there and people actually recognising it for how important it really is. So thank you for being here. And I thought I'd start off by getting to know you all. So just a raise of hands, who would say they had a good night's sleep last night? Probably 50%. That's good. Yeah, okay. And is anyone here a shift worker? A couple of shift workers. There's more than 2 million shift workers in Australia, and that number's just increasing as the definition kind of changes. You know, you're thinking of Uber Eats, you're thinking of all of these people who are now far more online and accessible and working outside of those normal 9 to 5 hours. And I think COVID's had an impact on that even more. Who really works 9 to 5 in the general sense anymore? So then, is there anyone who knows shift workers? Is that raise more hands? Yeah, cool. So I'll be talking a little bit about that today as well. And has anyone heard of the term sleep hygiene before? A few people, so you're familiar with what it is. That's great. We actually asked a number of people what sleep hygiene was, a lot of friends of ours within the Appleton Institute from around the world, and some people were saying, you know, washing your sheets before going to bed, and it's true, like the term sleep hygiene is a little bit confusing, and we're actually thinking and asking some questions about potentially shifting it to healthy sleep practices and trying to make it more relevant to people who might not be particularly within the sleep field, and so that when you hear it, it's more directly relevant to what it actually is. So the definition of sleep hygiene is that it encompasses a range of lifestyle, behavioural and environmental factors that are intended to promote healthy sleep. So it's kind of all the things you're doing throughout your day that sends messages to the brain that then will have an impact on your sleep behaviour. And I'm going to cover a whole heap of those with some tips for you today. So just a little bit of information around Australians and sleep and why sleep is so important. And it was interesting when I asked how many people had had a good night's sleep. It was probably about 55% who put your hand up. And we do have the statistic that 33 to 45% of Australians actually report getting inadequate sleep, which is such a large number. And we know that sleep is so important. It's really key to our health, our performance, our safety, our quality of life. It really has a direct impact on everything that we do. And it's just as essential as I mentioned around physical activity, healthy eating, and then that mindfulness and wellbeing, all the things that this expo is about today. That's why I'm really excited to be here. And when we think about trying to improve our sleep, there's kind of different steps or levels that we take. So it's not just straight into one method fixes all, but we try to kind of work our way up and help people understand what sleep is, implement some practices, and then if there's still sleep problems, seek that next level of treatment that they might need. So I'm going to kind of focus on these two base levels here today and provide you with a little bit of psychoeducation, a little bit of an understanding of what sleep is. And you might have heard some of it already today, so I apologise if there's a bit of overlap. I won't go into it too much, but just kind of the things that form the basis to help you understand why we recommend what we recommend around that sleep hygiene recommendations. So what is normal sleep? And we did a survey where we asked what the shape of a healthy night's sleep would look like, and 70% drew a U shape like this one here. So essentially saying that you start your night, you go into sleep, you have a deep sleep, and then you wake up, going back into lighter sleep. But in fact, and I'm sure probably many of you might be aware of this, I feel like that knowledge is getting more out there, but sleep is a series of cycles between light and deep sleep. We go through multiple sleep cycles in a night, and waking up during that is completely normal, and many of the awakenings you don't even really remember. And now if you've got a Fitbit or some of your mobile phone apps, you might be seeing that they've got awakenings there and that your number's more than what you think. So that is completely normal. You don't need to be alarmed by that. I remember the first time I wore an actigraph, which is similar to a Fitbit but used in sleep research, and a bit more expensive than a Fitbit. And I was like 35 awakenings. Like I don't remember any of that. So it's really interesting that that is completely normal. And I think from a psychoeducation perspective for parents of newborns, that's one of the first things that we like to tell people is waking up is completely normal. So the key part here is then just being able to return to sleep in a reasonable amount of time as well. So what does a sleep cycle actually look like? This is what a sleep cycle looks like. It's kind of all over the shop. Now, this one's a little bit outdated. They've changed it to 3 sleep stages instead of 4, but it gives you this idea. So starting at 0, that's awake, and then stage 1 sleep is your lighter sleep, going through to your deep sleep. And what you can see here is that the first part of your night with sleep is when you're actually having that deep restorative sleep. And that's the sleep that when you get woken up and you're not ready to be woken up, and you wake up and you're really groggy, kind of disorientated, that's when you're being woken up out of deep sleep. And my colleague, who is also Alex's PhD supervisor, Dr. Grace Vincent, has done a lot of research with shift workers, firefighters, trying to look at those who are on call. So, they might be having this opportunity and then they get a call out, and trying to help them to minimise that level of grogginess and inability to be awake and functioning at that high level that they need to be, jumping in a car and driving somewhere when waking up from deep sleep. So that's deep sleep. And then as the night progresses, you go through more lighter stages of sleep, and you're going to have some of that REM sleep. So that's rapid eye movement sleep, and this is the sleep where you have your dreams. So you might always feel like you're dreaming more as it comes to the morning. That's completely normal. That's when you have that stage of sleep, and often when you're about to wake up, you're having those dreams, which is why you can kind of either remember them for a long time or just that little bit of time, but that's where you are having your dreams. And the other little bit of psychoeducation I just wanted to give you was just around the regulation of sleep, so how we sleep. And it is involuntary. Sleep is an automatic process, which means it is technically out of our own direct voluntary control. And there are these 2 processes in the brain that are responsible for sleep and waking, and that is homeostatic pressure, which is essentially that sleep pressure that builds for the longer that you are awake, and your circadian rhythm, which I'm sure many people might be more familiar with, that internal body clock. So I'll just give a brief overview of those, starting with the homeostatic sleep pressure. So homeostasis is really all about maintaining the body's internal environment so that it's stable and in this relatively constant condition. And when we talk about homeostasis in relation to sleep, we refer to that pressure. So this is kind of a pressure gauge that you can see on the screen. When your spring, I'm going to refer to it as a spring, is nice and loose, that means that the pressure isn't there and you're quite alert. So that typically happens in the morning. And then the longer that you're awake, that sleepiness pressure builds up, and your spring starts to wound tighter and tighter and tighter. And then when you go to the far end, you're so tired, that's often when you might be falling asleep on the couch, when you don't want to be, or when you can go to bed and fall asleep quite easily if you don't have other sleep issues. So the sleep pressure is one of those processes that really helps you. And the cool thing about the sleep pressure is that it dissipates for the longer that you are asleep. So if you get your full 7 to 9 hours of sleep at night, you're going to wake up and that spring's going to be nice and loose, and you're going to be ready to go on with your day, and then it'll start to build the longer that you go on. But let's say, now that travel's kind of back on, I got to come here for the first time in 2.5 years, let's say you booked a red-eye flight. Always seems like a good idea. It's cheaper, but it means that you're probably waking up at 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning. You probably didn't go to bed early enough to get your 7 to 9 hours of sleep. And so you're going to wake up and that spring isn't nice and loose. It's still going to be really tight, tightly wound. And so you're starting your day already with sleep pressure built up, and that's going to have an impact. You're going to feel sleepier throughout the day and have that cumulative effect of not getting enough sleep. Brief overview of that one. Now we'll go to the circadian rhythm, which is the other process. So this is your body clock, which is actually set to approximately 24.2 hours, and it controls a whole heap of functions in our bodies. I am 2 parts annoyed at the circadian rhythm this week. In Adelaide, it was the end of daylight savings, and I have a 1-year-old, and he is now waking an hour earlier, and I'm like, that's so cool. Look how the body clock just knows that. But also, damn it, I want more sleep. So the circadian rhythm doesn't just worry about your sleep, it's also when you eat and your hunger, core body temperature, which is a really cool way to get a visual of what our circadian rhythm looks like, hormone secretion, and also our performance. So when we are actually alert and at our peak place to perform. And it is influenced by the light and darkness. So a key tip, a nice easy one that you can do is in the morning, get some bright natural light into your eyes, open up those windows, let your body clock know it's morning, it's time to be alert, let's do this. So that's a nice easy one. And then at night, and this is where it's a little bit tricky with all of the artificial light that we have now, is trying to turn off those phones, turn off the computer, reduce that blue light that can also be confused for daylight, and just try and be in a dimly lit room and signal to your body that it is time to go to sleep. And then your circadian rhythm that also controls your hormone secretion releases melatonin. You might have heard of melatonin. I feel like it's come about and it's very popular at the moment. But it's a naturally made hormone in our body that does signal that it is time to go to sleep. So this is a cool little diagram that I told you core body temperature allows us to map the circadian rhythm. So the blue line shows you that during the day at your peak, the circadian rhythm is up, and then there's a dip at night. And the green line is the melatonin. So you can see that as it comes into about 10 o'clock, 9:30, 10 o'clock, the melatonin is released, and that helps you to go to sleep. And then by the morning, that's gone again so that you can be alert. And these two processes actually work together really well. And even, when you have that 2 p.m. dip after lunch, that is totally normal. That's because your pressure's been building up. But your circadian rhythm then kicks in and goes, no, this is when we're peak alert. So they work together to help you stay alert and then fall asleep easier as well. So in an ideal world, when all things are going well and they're working together, you sleep well. That is my psychoeducation, and I'm going to link back to that so that you can see how that information and the things that we're recommending impacts those two processes predominantly. So now I'm going to talk about these healthy sleep practices. And where do you find these sleep hygiene guidelines, and what are they? So if you do a quick Google search, this is the sort of image that you'll see, the sort of information that you can get, and it's relatively accurate. It gives some good feedback there. So things like reducing, your alcohol, smoking, caffeine intake, and the better things to do, having a bedtime routine. So these infographics are actually quite helpful. And we had an honours student who did some research and asked some shift workers about where they actually get their information about sleep hygiene. And I know some of you had heard from it, so I'd be curious to know how this research matches up to where you found out about it. So there's a whole heap of websites. Sleep Health Foundation's great, SDA obviously. I have a brochure here. I've got some that you can grab that'll give an overview of what we've spoken about as well. So there's information out there for sure. And for shift workers, what they found was that there is this formal education and workplace training for about 20% of them. But that's still not a large number, so that's part of why Alex got into the PhD. She wants to educate people, particularly shift workers, around sleep hygiene. Online was a popular one, GPs 12%. Another key area in the sleep field at the moment is trying to increase GP knowledge on sleep and being able to give them that so that the first people you go to can directly help you with this sort of information as well. I'm just going to do a little bit of science here before I move into it, but just to kind of reassure you that there has been scientific studies and research into the recommendations that we're providing, and the majority of these sleep hygiene components are actually supported by epidemiologic and laboratory research. So that's great, but there is always that thing, and I'm going to give you a whole list of strategies, and from that clinical perspective, just think about what works best for you. Consider picking a couple of the strategies and focusing on those, definitely for those who work in clinical settings. That's what they're doing. They're trying to focus on one or two, not trying to do everything all at once. And just being conscious that the modification of one sleep hygiene behaviour might have an impact on the other. So the example I have here is that caffeine withdrawal, if you were to cut out caffeine, can then be associated with increased stress, decreased exercise, which could have other impacts. So just know yourself. There's obviously a lot of individual differences, but when you're thinking about these practices, don't feel like you have to do all of them. Be aware, self-aware as to what's going to work for you. This is lovely Alex on the screen, who couldn't be here today, but she started off her research by doing a systematic literature review looking at sleep hygiene in shift workers, because one of the biggest issues with shift workers, and I mentioned it earlier when I was talking about the sleep, what is that, the sleep, you guys know what I'm talking about, the nice little diagram, I didn't get enough sleep last night. Yeah, the non-you, the sleep cycles. Yeah, there we go. Shift workers have to go against a lot of those things. So, for example, the fatigue management strategies that they have contradict what we have for sleep hygiene recommendations. Things like using caffeine in the middle of the night because they need to stay alert, but then we're obviously not recommending that elsewhere. So, there aren't actually specific sleep hygiene recommendations for shift workers at this point, but we are currently doing that. Alex is doing that study right as we speak, so I've got some kind of inside information that we're working with experts from all around the world, sleep hygiene experts, to try and develop these specific ones for shift workers. And keep an eye out for the orange boxes on the next few slides, because they'll give you an idea of how you can tailor it if you are a shift worker or you know someone who is a shift worker. Okay, so what are these sleep hygiene recommendations? First one sounds really simple, but prioritising sleep is really key. So we know life is busy, but sleep should still be a top priority. Now, I am very guilty of not doing this, even to do this presentation. What did I choose to not do so I could get this done? Sleep. So, one more episode of Netflix. What are you choosing to then lose an hour of? Sleep. It's the easiest thing, I think, when you're trying to get more hours in a day to cut some out of sleep. So just trying to remember that sleep is really important and to prioritise it is an easy and simple strategy that you can try and implement. Like I said, I'm still guilty. From a shift work perspective, it can be even harder. You might have even more limited time, so you schedule in social activities, so prioritising sleep is still key there. And also informing family, friends, neighbours of your sleep schedule, so any environmental factors that might be impacting your sleep at those odd times during the day. Something like mowing the lawn. I know it might seem silly, but like if that wakes you up or disturbs your only sleep pattern and then you're going back on night shift the next night, something simple like that can make a big difference. They might be able to do it in your middle of the day when you're not sleeping. How much sleep should you actually be getting? The National Sleep Foundation recommends for adults typically 7 to 9 hours. Obviously, your individual sleep needs do differ, and when I do work with adolescents, obviously they get these school holidays where they don't have a lot of responsibilities. Maybe some of them might be working, but we're always limited by the time we have to get up in the morning, and that's the big movement with changing in school start times and things like that. But yeah, if you have a week off as adults where you don't have to get up, you're not constrained by whatever you have on the next day, the way to find out how much sleep you specifically need is to just kind of go to bed at a time, don't set an alarm, and see how long you sleep for, how many hours you need. And do that over a few days though, not just a couple, because you might be catching up on sleep. But you can't ever really catch up on sleep, but your body tries to compensate a little bit. So that's a little tip there. But also just to remember that is the total time that you're spending asleep, not just your time in bed. So being aware, if you go to bed and you're on your phone scrolling for an hour, which is bad anyway, that doesn't count into your time sleeping. And from a shift work perspective, you're probably not going to have that one sleep episode or sleep period. So that main sleep might be supplemented by a number of shorter sleeps. And I always love speaking to taxi drivers or Uber drivers. I got in late last night and they drive nights all the time. They have to be alert. So I always love asking them about their sleep schedule and when they choose to nap and how that works with family things and bits and pieces. So shift workers they're actually quite self-aware most of the time of what works for them. From a sleep schedule perspective, and this is another one that can be quite tricky, particularly from an adolescent, but even for some adults, it's nice to have a sleep in if you can. I've, again, learnt that with a child, that doesn't really happen. But having that regular sleep schedule, so going to bed and getting up the same time each day is really important, and that's important because of your body clock. So the more time that you do the same things, like I said with my son, that's going to help you. It's going to help your quality of sleep. It's going to help your sleep duration. And with adolescents, it's often more tricky because they want to stay up later and then sleep in, and then they've got to get up for school start times and everything. So you might be finding it's the same for you on a weekend, but as much as you can maintain that regular schedule, that's going to help that body clock of yours, and that's going to help your sleep overall. My main tip as well is to always work backwards from the time that you have to wake up in the morning to figure out your 7 to 9 hours of sleep. You probably will do that and go, wow, that's really early, or I don't know, I've got so many other things to do. But at least you can be conscious of it then as to how many hours, rather than, maybe hopping into bed and setting that alarm and then it tells you 5 hours and 50 minutes until you're waking up in the morning and you go, oh, I should have gone to bed earlier. So just having that regular schedule and doing that is going to be helpful. From a shift work perspective, obviously the sleep schedule is going to be more dependent on the shift schedule and lifestyle that's going on. But what we do recommend is to try to maintain the same sleep schedule for each type of shift. So anytime that you're working a day shift, you have the same bedtime. Anytime you're working a night shift, you're working that same bedtime. So that there's still some element of regularity despite those constant changes with shifts. Another really simple one, bedtime routine. Has anyone got a bedtime routine? The same things that they do every night, yeah? Cool. Again, with my son, it's so cool to go back to some of these things with babies who you have control over to an extent, to a very small extent. But bedtime routine is one of them, and it just shows how much it signals to him that it is time to go to sleep. And we can have that exact same power. You know, you can do those exact same things in the lead up to bed, no matter what, where or when or however, even if you're traveling, you know, internationally, now that things are starting to pick up with jet lag, if you put your sleep routine into place, your body knows that we're about to go to sleep. So that definitely helps. And how you spend your time before bed can really have that big impact on your quality of sleep, particularly that 1 to 2 hours before bed. So we recommend trying to find activities that help you wind down and help you feel relaxed, and that you consistently engage in these before you're going to bed. And ideally, dimly lit, quiet environment, which takes me to the light exposure. And this is really asking that we limit our screen time and exposure to that blue light, so mobile phones, TV screens, laptops, in the 1 to 2 hours before bed. One of my biggest things around working in this area is you say these things, but we all know that part of winding down is often in front of a screen. So it's well and good to say this, but it's just like, okay, what's the actual compromise? What are we willing to do? And I think some of the research that's come out of this ideally, I'm going to say this is the best thing to do, but another thing to consider with your screen time is what are you using your screen time for? So if you're not actively too engaged, so video games might be a little bit too much, you know, you might be getting too excited and having other effects, but watching a movie from a distance that isn't a scary movie or getting you too worked up could still be a good way for you to wind down and not have that direct impact. Scrolling, you know, if you can keep your phone out of your bedroom or like on the side table. I asked adolescents what they'd be willing to do, and they said that when there was actually time to go to bed, they'd put it on charge on the other side of the room so that it wasn't right there to tempt them to pick it up. So little changes can still help. These are obviously the recommendations, but those little changes will make a difference. And from a shift work perspective, for those who might be finishing night shift and then driving home, we obviously know with the circadian rhythm, I said when you wake up in the morning, you know, open the blinds and get some sleep get the sunlight in and let your body know that you're awake. For shift workers who are finishing and then have to drive home, that sunlight's going to be coming in. So trying to limit that sunlight at that time is important too. So wearing sunglasses is an easy way to try and make a difference there. Napping. So napping is one in the general population. It's not super encouraged, and if you are going to do it, try and nap for 20 to 30 minutes so that you're less likely to enter that deep sleep that we were talking about and then waking up feeling groggy and struggling to function at that high level straight away. It can take that little while. And if you are going to nap, aim to do that between late morning and early afternoon. So ideally no later than 3 p.m. And that's all to do with that sleep pressure that we were talking about, the spring. So even though it might be tight, as soon as you lose some of that sleep pressure, it has to build back up again. Otherwise you might find yourself lying awake and not being able to easily fall asleep. And this little diagram just shows that. So you can see here at the morning, the sleep drive, the sleep pressure is low. And as you go throughout the day heading towards bedtime, it increases. And then it allows you to go into that deep sleep and then the lighter sleep in the morning and then keep going. But if you have a nap there in the middle of the day, that pressure will dissipate. Not fully dissipate because you're probably only having a shorter nap. But you can see then that it takes more time to build and it doesn't reach to that same level of pressure. So when we say about naps and the timing of it, think back to that spring. And the other thing when we say about 20 to 30 minutes of naps, again, that's not time in bed, it's sleep. So it can be tricky to know how to set an alarm. Like when do I set my alarm to wake up in 20 to 30 minutes if it takes me 15 minutes to fall asleep? So trying to be semi-aware again of how long it normally takes you to fall asleep and then setting your alarm for that within that 5-minute kind of buffer zone is the recommendation that I'd have for that one. From a shift work perspective, there's probably two different types of naps that will be useful. So those short naps of 15 to 20 minutes, again, not going over that, they can help to boost alertness and performance. So for particularly if you are on shift, ambulance driver, and you've got that opportunity before another call out comes to have a short nap, that can be great. Or before you're going out to do a social activity, that shorter nap might be able to help boost you up. And there's those longer naps that can help you, around 90 minutes, that can help you reach that 7 to 9 hours in a 24-hour period. They can help to reduce that sleep debt that you've got. But keep in mind that longer naps should be avoided in the 4 to 6 hours before your main sleep, as they can make it more difficult to fall asleep. So again, for shift workers like a firefighter or an ambulance who might have the opportunity to sleep while they're at work, thinking about how close that is if then their schedule is going to come into play. They might not be able to go to sleep easier when they get home. So it's a bit of a juggle, and that's why these guidelines are still kind of going through iterations to try and give the best advice that we can. Caffeine. So healthy adults should have no more than 400 milligrams of caffeine each day. That's the national guidelines here in Australia. So that equates to about 1 large coffee of 3 espresso shots, 1 500ml energy drink, or around 3 to 4 cups of tea. And caffeine can stay in your body for a lot longer than you think, have those effects for a lot longer than you think. It's a natural stimulant. It's found in a lot of things, not just drinks, also chocolate. I'm a chocolate fiend. I don't do coffee, but I do a lot of chocolate. So being aware of that is good to know as well. And is actually the most consumed stimulant substance in the world. And that's all due to those energizing effects that it can definitely have. Interestingly, it's not absorbed into your bloodstream until about 30 to 60 minutes. So, you know, when you think you might have your first sip and you automatically feel better, that's probably more a placebo effect. It does take that little bit longer to get into your bloodstream. And those effects do linger in your system as well. So from a shift work perspective, again, from a fatigue management strategy, it's really good to use caffeine. And there are recommendations there to do that to improve alertness and performance. But those effects can last for several hours and much longer than people think. So at the same point, it can vary greatly. I know people who have a coffee right before bed and then they sleep. So there is that inter-individual difference. But generally speaking, keeping in mind how close to bedtime you're having caffeine is important. Alcohol is a naturally occurring substance that, is released I'm not going to go into the process of how alcohol is there, but a lot of people do think that alcohol helps them to fall asleep. And it might help you to fall asleep, but it then messes with your sleep staging after and has a really big impact on your sleep quality. So while for some people it's like, if I have this glass, it might help me to go to sleep quicker, it isn't really recommended. And again, something to consider around the timing of your alcohol consumption. It does take several hours for your body to fully process each drink. So do try to limit your consumption in the 4 hours before bed. Nicotine, we're currently going through these guidelines for the shift workers, and all of the experts, the only one that got agreed upon in the first round was nicotine. So similar to caffeine, it's a stimulant. It's found in tobacco, and it has this stimulating effect on your body that can reach your brain in less than 10 seconds. So then how it's more impacting your sleep is that can be a really a big thing that people miss. So during sleep, they might have those withdrawals, want to get up and do that. So that there's a lot of negative health effects for having nicotine. So the recommendation is to try to avoid nicotine-containing products altogether to help with your health risk overall. But if you do consume nicotine, try and limit it in the 6 hours before bed. And again, it's really tricky because if it is addictive and those sorts of things, but that's the recommendation that we go by. Medication can also impact sleep. So if you are on any medication, it can be good to just check with your healthcare provider if it is going to have an impact on your sleep behaviour before you start taking it regularly. Sleep-inducing medications have their place, and if you are working with a health professional to take those, that's your prerogative, and hopefully that's helping you. Our guideline here is only used for short-term or intermittent relief of sleep problems, but obviously if there are individual circumstances, then go by the advice of your healthcare provider. And melatonin is the one, I guess, that comes in, and this is where with our shift worker recommendations or considerations we do think about. So I spoke about melatonin earlier, and you can see that here again on the green line. So based on how your circadian rhythm works, it is meant to secrete that more at nighttime for shift workers who might need to fall asleep at different times of the day. That goes against when their body naturally secretes that hormone. That's where melatonin can be really useful to give them that hit to help them fall asleep. So just a bit of context as how that works. Diet, I mean, when we talk about sleep, diet and physical activity obviously overall do help your health, but it's kind of thinking about how does it directly impact sleep. I'm not going to tell you, eating healthy is a good thing to do in general, but when we're thinking about sleep, it's really about that digestion. Giving yourself enough time to digest the food so that you're not uncomfortable while you're sleeping. So ideally 2 to 3 hours before lying down. A colleague of mine at the Appleton Institute does a lot of work on shift work and eating on shifts. So the recommendation for shift workers is to limit the food intake during night shifts, and if you do eat, opt for the smaller, lighter meals. But at the same time, this constant balance, you don't want to be going to bed hungry, because if you're hungry, that's going to have an impact on your sleep during the day as well. Fluid intake. I'm sure we've all been there where you've had a big drink of water right before bed and then you're caught getting up, going to the toilet multiple times. So it is important to maintain hydration, however, avoid too much fluid before bed to try and limit those sleep disturbances. And from a shift worker perspective, if you're ever trying to sleep during the day, you're more likely to go to the toilet more frequently during the day. So even if you have limited your intake, that can easily happen. From an exercise perspective, what went around for a number of years was that you shouldn't exercise too close to bedtime. There is some research evidence now that suggests that it doesn't have that much of an impact on your sleep from the night time. If you are exercising right at night time, they haven't done it at different times of the day for shift workers yet. That's still in progress. But that is good to know that doing that exercise, because again, hours in the day. If you're working, you want to fit in exercise, but you want to prioritize sleep and you're trying to juggle everything. So you can exercise at night, that is okay. But just keep in mind your bedtime routine and still finding that time to wind down before bed. Bedroom environment, 16 to 20 degrees, make it as dark as you can, block out as much light as possible, and keep it as quiet as you can. Close doors, windows, depending if you've got other people there. Earplugs can be good if you've got a snorer, and also white noise. I did not know the value of white noise until I had my baby, and now he can be awake and I can be in the room with white noise and I don't hear him. It's beautiful. So if you haven't tried that and you are getting caught up with other noises, white noise does drown some things out, so it might be useful. And just on the bedroom, use it for sex and sleep only, ideally, if at all possible. So really trying to avoid those mentally stimulating activities in bed, so playing videos, working on a laptop, all just comes down to your association. So if you associate bed with sleep, that's going to be a good thing. And also just be mindful of sharing your bed with others, so partners, pets are a big one. If they're disturbing you, then you might want to think about who you prioritise more, the pet or your sleep. And just my last slide before I'll go to some questions. I appreciate how well you've listened. I feel like I've talked a lot. But if you are unable to sleep, get out of bed and do something relaxing in a quiet, dimly lit environment. There's nothing worse than sitting there and just watching the clock. That's not going to help you. Again, it's that association. If you then associate lying in bed and just waiting to go to sleep again, you're going to get frustrated, and then you might think of that or have those feelings before you go to bed the next night as well. So try to get out, limit your screen time. Don't be tempted to go to your phone and scroll until you feel sleepy, but get out of bed and go back to bed when you are feeling sleepy again. And if you are feeling like you've got sleep problems that are occurring multiple times a week that you can't put down to other circumstances, definitely go and see a healthcare professional. Any questions?
Hi there. I was just wondering, with shift workers that alternate between working night and working day, do you find that you can overcome that sleep disturbance, or is melatonin really just going to be the best thing if they struggle to get to sleep and then they wake up in the morning and they're struggling to get back to work? Like, just that switching between day and night sleeping can't really be overcome that well, or?
I think there's individual factors within that. So some people can and some people can't. And melatonin is a safe thing to use if you are finding, and I mean, it all comes down to like the different shift types and how soon you are switching back and forth and how often you've done it for. So this is why I think there aren't guidelines specifically out there for shift workers, because it's really hard. And even the first iteration that we did, we put it out to the experts and you just get contradicting views on, you can't say that, you can't do this about that, you can't say that specifically about this shift because it might be something for this. So there's so many variables there. As with the treatment kind of stepped plan, I think if you can spend the time to try and implement the healthy sleep practices first, and then if you're really finding that's not working, then seeking other things, and melatonin is a good one to go with. Yeah.
The question is, what can you do when it takes you a really long time to get to sleep? You know, where you try and you just take hours, 3 hours, say, to get to sleep.
Yeah. Are you finding that you're tired before you're going into bed?
Yes.
Yeah, and then you just can't, you get into bed and you can't go to sleep. What do you do in those 3 hours if you're sitting there?
Not much.
No?
But I can't sleep.
You can't sleep. Have you tried getting out of bed again and trying to do something? Do you have a bedtime routine?
I better have one now, I guess.
Yeah. So I think it's tricky, and you can't force yourself. As much as I say it's an automatic process, sleeping, when you do struggle to sleep, there's nothing worse. Insomnia is awful, and you're not alone. 45% of people do find that. So trying to implement some of these things, I think signalling to your body with a routine will be helpful. Look at your caffeine intake, alcohol, like all of those bits and pieces, and see if you can modify something. But no, I don't have a magic answer. I'm sorry.